Okay, so what I'm going to cover is, like this says, the affirmative for the middle school novice and a little bit for high school novice. So to break down some terms here, just to refresh, affirmative means, right, that like in policy debate, you have an affirmative side and a negative side. The affirmative side proposes some sort of policy change or some sort of policy action by the United States federal government. The negative refutes that policy change, says that change is a bad idea for whatever reason. Middle school novice basically means like this is the division for people who have never done debate before, who have minimal debate experience. So we're mostly going to be covering middle school novice stuff. However, there is going to be some overlap with high school novice later on. So I will try to make sure to say when that overlap is going to happen. The other thing, just to just another thing that I will cover later is also the set of evidence that you will have access to as the negative to answer this affirmative case argument. And by case argument, that just means like the affirmative case. Why is the change to the status quo that the affirmative proposing, why is that a good idea? That's usually referred to as the case. Okay, so first, just as a quick recap in terms of the parts of an affirmative. First is the advantage/harms, which is usually a problem in the status quo, right? If something is harmful, that means it's a bad thing. Inherency, which in the vocabulary of policy debate means the reason or set of reasons why the problem isn't being solved right now. The plan is just the 1 or 2 sentence explanation to explain what exactly you're doing to change the status quo. The status quo means the way things are right now. It's how you want to change things so that you solve the problem that you have outlined in your advantages/harms, and then solvency is the reason why the plan solves the harms of the status quo. So the current topic for this year for high school policy debate is, and I don't remember the exact wording, but it's to the effect of the United States should, oh, sorry, see somebody saying something in the chat. Oh, can I share slides after the talk? Yes, I think I may be able to share the PowerPoint file in the Zoom chat. If I'm not able to do that, I will try to get it sent out on some sort of email from the AUDL email account. No worries, no worries. That's a reasonable question. Sorry. Right. So back to the sort of set of arguments proper, not just the like general structure. So firstly, the current topic is essentially the United States federal government should work more with NATO in areas revolving around emerging technology. The specific area that we're going to be talking about is biotechnology, that the United States federal government should cooperate more with NATO in terms of biotechnology development. So our specific affirmative argument, or the core affirmative argument, is essentially that the United States federal government, or USFG to be short, should work with NATO more in terms of their pandemic preparedness programs and operations. So the advantage/harms of this would be NATO is unprepared for pandemics, as NATO is currently unprepared for pandemics, and that pandemics uniquely and disproportionately affect people of color, poor people, a lot of people who are already sort of marginalized by current societal fault lines. The inherency is that NATO does not currently have the resources to be adequately prepared now. The plan is that the United States federal government should support NATO's pandemic preparedness programs, right? We want to fund and fully support those. And then the solvency is the argument that supporting these programs will be enough to make sure that NATO is ready for that next pandemic, right? That the plan would be enough to get NATO to respond effectively to a pandemic. One thing I'll explain before going on to the next slide is this 1AC term. So this refers to the speech order in policy debate, right? I'm not going to go too much into it now, but the short of it is that the affirmative has the first speech, right? They are proposing a policy change or proposing a course of action that the negative then has to respond to. So the affirmative gets the first speech, and that first speech is called the first affirmative constructive, or 1AC for short. So when this says pandemics 1AC, that just means this is the sort of set of arguments that you will be forwarding when you are giving your 1AC for this pandemic affirmative. One second. Right. So a couple of key concepts for this 1AC. First, pandemic preparedness, which is the idea that it's a question of how much is the government prepared for a pandemic before it happens? Does it have good public health infrastructure? Can it research, develop, and distribute vaccines effectively and in a timely manner, et cetera? Another is the panic neglect cycle, which is the idea that when responding to pandemics, there is usually a pattern of that response. When a pandemic first hits a certain society or hits a certain government, right, there is a response of panic, right? Like, we don't know what's going on. We need to further research this pandemic, this virus, and try to get it under control, develop a vaccine, et cetera, right? And the reason it's called panic is because it's not because the government or institutions that would be responsible for pandemic preparedness, it's because they didn't adequately prepare, right? So they're panicking and not maybe making the best policy or public health options available. The neglect part of the cycle is the idea that once a current pandemic is over, then people will forget about the risk of future pandemics, and so won't make those investments into public health or public health policy, so that when the next pandemic rolls around, that just causes another iteration or another version of the panic neglect cycle. The last sort of key concept I wanted to emphasize was pandemic inevitability, which is basically the argument that future pandemics, or at least future disease outbreaks, are inevitable, right? Like, there are tons of new diseases, tons of new viruses coming every year, so it's impossible to say that we will eliminate all disease. So it's a question. And the reason that this is an affirmative argument is because if pandemics are inevitable, or at least if future disease outbreaks are inevitable, then we need to make sure that we are prepared to prevent those disease outbreaks from becoming pandemics, or to mitigate the impact of any potential future pandemics, which is why pandemic preparedness is so important. So now I'm going to go into sort of a closer reading of the 1AC evidence. This is, again, the evidence that you would be reading in your first speech if you are the affirmative. So firstly, to explain sort of the way this is formatted, contention one just means contention one is inherency, just means that this is my inherency argument, right? I want to explain my inherency argument first before I explain my other arguments. These two sentences: NATO is not prepared for the next pandemic, it lacks the funding and capacity to manage future crises. That's called a tag. That's essentially a short summary of the argument that you are substantiating or proving with evidence. And then DeMaio 2020, non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, is your citation, right? Who are you citing to make this argument? What are their qualifications? When did they publish their book or article or what have you? And then this section is just called a card. And by card, it refers to old debate practice when debate was still on paper. But essentially, a card is just an abbreviated version of an article, right? If you'll notice, there's underlining, there is boxing, there is bolding. All of that is essentially quoting the article, so that you are not reading an entire article, you're not reading an entire scientific article to prove a singular argument. Right. So what is important about the DeMaio evidence? I think DeMaio makes three important arguments for the affirmative. First is that NATO can and should play an important role in pandemic preparedness, right? They have the ability to do so. But the second argument is that they don't have the resources or support in order to be at their most effective right now. But that COVID and the response to COVID provides sort of a unique window of opportunity to better NATO's pandemic preparedness. So the next card or piece of evidence is Levy 2021. There is another Levy 2021 piece of evidence or card that I'll get to shortly. But this first Levy evidence says that NATO already has a lot of programs, funds, divisions, et cetera, to try to, that are already involved in pandemic preparedness, right? It's not, NATO is not starting from square one in this instance. There are a lot of different agencies and lots of different abbreviations that this card lists, so I'm not going to go through them all, but two, just to provide a general example, are the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center and the NATO Pandemic Response Fund. And I do want to stress that most likely it's not going to be that big of an issue whether or not you can name all of these different agencies and funds. It's just important so that you know what sort of the state of NATO pandemic preparedness is like in the status quo. And again, in the status quo means essentially the way things are now. So next is the Rogers piece of evidence. This Rogers evidence sort of outlines the panic neglect cycle argument that I was talking about earlier, right? That currently there is a panic neglect cycle in terms of pandemic preparedness, but again, COVID provides sort of a unique window of opportunity for NATO, for the United States federal government and for NATO to sort of break out of that line of thinking. Another sort of set of arguments that Rogers makes is the idea that we live in an age of pandemics. Rogers cites a lot of statistics about like what the current rate of pandemics are, right? How many diseases are we discovering every year? What do those diseases look like, right? For example, it says that more than 6 out of every 10 diseases jump from animals to humans, right? That like a lot of diseases are coming in from sources that we're not able to, monitor perfectly, right? And the final argument that Rogers makes that is important for our purposes is that research has proved effective at creating vaccines and responses to pandemics, as COVID demonstrates. So it's important to make sure that we are prepared as much as possible for any future pandemics. Sorry, I think I might have skipped ahead there. The second Levy card. The big quote from this piece of evidence is that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, which is essentially saying that it's best to invest in pandemic preparedness in things like public health infrastructure, science and technology research, vaccine development and distribution capabilities, because if you can prevent a disease from becoming a pandemic in the first place, then that's much less expensive, in terms of dollar amount or expenses to the government, but it's also a good thing because it prevents a lot of like the destruction and loss of life that a pandemic can bring if you can prevent a disease outbreak from becoming a pandemic in the first place. Another sort of key concept here is the idea about Article 3. Essentially, NATO is a military alliance that was founded shortly after World War II. I'm not going to go through the entire treaty that founded NATO, but Article 3 is the article of that founding treaty of NATO that focuses on like the resilience of the alliance. And the idea is that the affirmative would sort of interpret or use Article 3 to justify a bigger investment and bigger support for pandemic preparedness efforts. The next piece of evidence is the Wade piece of evidence, which substantiates the claim that pandemics disproportionately harm, quote, those are already marginalized, like people of color, poor people, right? That pandemics do not hit everybody equally, right? That some people are more at risk of pandemics than others, not just because of any underlying health issues, but because of the existing fault lines of society, especially as it relates to like public health infrastructure, economic inequality, et cetera. The argument here would be that the way this fits in with the rest of the affirmative would essentially be to say that pandemic preparedness, being better equipped for pandemics, better prevents those sort of unequal effects of future disease outbreaks and of future pandemics. So the next, okay. So remember when I said that we would be covering a little bit of high school novice stuff? This is where it comes in. So all of what I just said, all those arguments and all those pieces of evidence are shared, I believe, are shared between the high school novice and between the middle school novice affirmatives, right? Both of them are versions of the pandemic affirmatives. But since the high school division has slightly longer speech times, the high school version of the pandemics affirmative has what is called an extra advantage, right? An extra set of harms that are happening in the status quo that that same plan of action would resolve, right? So this is that second advantage that is you should just be concerned about if you're like a high school novice, right? If you're a middle school novice, you don't need to worry about this part of the lecture or this part of the PowerPoint that much. So the first piece of evidence is the Iftimi. I am probably mispronouncing that. But this piece of evidence just says that currently threats of bioterrorism are on the rise because of COVID. Bioterrorism is essentially the use of biological weapons for an act of terrorism, right? The idea that you can, I don't know, drop a bomb of weaponized COVID on a city and carry out a terror attack in that sense. So the idea is that NATO currently wants to expand its ability to respond to and to prepare against bioterror attacks. The second piece of Iftimi evidence, again, sort of says that NATO can play an important role in preventing and responding to bioterror attacks, but that they're not as well equipped and as well funded to do so in the status quo, which is where the plan comes in, right? That we need more funding and more support for NATO's pandemic preparedness programs. And because we do that, we also bolster NATO's ability to respond to bioterror attacks. I think this is the last piece of evidence in this bioterror advantage, the Millet and Snyder-Beatty evidence. This is a piece of evidence that explains why it's beyond the obvious why it's bad for terrorists to have, the capability to use biological weapons. The argument is that terrorists have both means and motives to cause extinction, right? If they can develop biological weapons, that they will have the capability and the desire to use those biological weapons in a way that will result in the extinction of the human race. And it lists a couple of different examples of terrorist organizations or terrorist organizations that have used or intended to use biological weapons for the express purpose of causing human extinction. One such example is Aum Shinrikyo, which was a doomsday cult that in the 90s carried out bioterrorist attacks on the Tokyo subway. So all of which is to say that terrorists getting biological weapons is bad because it could cause human extinction, in addition to just generally being a bad idea to begin with. So I know that was a lot of concepts to throw at people, but we still have to cover, what the negative says, right? Like, it's one thing to present this, like, let's say you were writing an essay for, I don't know, your English class, and your teacher was like, oh, this is a really good essay about like NATO and pandemic preparedness. But in the debate context, you will also have the negative who responds to the affirmative's case arguments. So we're also going to go through, do a little bit of a close reading of the set of negative evidence that will respond directly to the affirmative case. The reason I say respond directly to is an important distinction that will sort of come up in Elysia section, but the short of it is this is a set of arguments that are meant to directly refute and directly disprove the ideas that the 1AC, the first affirmative constructive, puts forward. So first is the Schreiber Card. Now, before I get into the Schreiber Card, this is in response to that first advantage, right? The idea that currently NATO is unprepared for future pandemics now. So if you'll notice, this says, first, the status quo solves. A has a bunch of blank lines, and then B has this evidence in the sort of form we've talked about earlier. Now, this first section, A, is meant for you to come up with your own arguments, right? We don't just want people to read evidence that you've already been given, but to sort of produce your own arguments to show that like you understand the general concepts that you're arguing about and that you're better able to think on your feet, which is one of the most important skills that debate can teach you. So this first section, A, whatever argument you can think of that supports the general argument that the status quo solves, you would write in there. And by status quo solves, we mean the idea that the way things are now are actually good, or at least good enough to prevent the harms that the 1AC that the affirmative is talking about. So in the context of the affirmative, the context of this specific affirmative, the status quo solves would mean that either the United States federal government or NATO is actually pretty good at responding to pandemics now, right? That they have the ability and the means to do so. So this Schreiber Card specifically says that the United States federal government is working on a bunch of different measures to sort of combat the next pandemic, right? It mentions sort of they were drafting a new roadmap and strengthening healthcare systems. They were going to establish a new disease forecasting center, right? So this Schreiber Card is saying that the United States federal government is actually very interested in pandemic preparedness now and is taking steps to make sure that they will be able to respond to pandemics in the future. So the next is the Schreiber Card. So like I mentioned earlier, you will see this blank section under A. That is for you to come up with your own arguments. But the general argument here is that the plan can't solve. And by that, we mean the idea that, yeah, even if like NATO has a problem with pandemic funding or pandemic preparedness now, even if you give them more funding and more support, they wouldn't actually be able to respond to pandemics effectively, which is the evidence that the Shea evidence makes. This Shea evidence essentially lists a lot of examples of different NATO members being unable to prevent themselves from being infected or exposed to COVID. And the general argument there is that if NATO can't protect themselves from COVID, from getting COVID, then they're not going to be able to build pandemic preparedness infrastructure or agencies or support to better respond to any future pandemics or any future disease outbreaks. So this is where we, again, talk about the biological terrorism advantage. And again, this is mostly for the high school novice. For the high school novice demographic, you don't need to worry about this too much if you are a middle school novice. But essentially, the argument here is that there is no impact to biological terrorism, is the sort of big umbrella argument. Now, what I mean by no impact to biological terrorism is the idea that there's not actually that big of a risk of biological terrorism. There is not that big of a risk of terrorists using biological weapons to carry out acts of terrorism. So again, that sort of A section is for you to come up with your own argument or your own set of arguments to support that general argument that we shouldn't be as worried as biological terrorism. So this argument actually has two different pieces of evidence to support it. This first one is the first Bill and Newman piece of evidence, which says that essentially terrorists, yes, are interested and have historically been interested in using biological terror attacks, or in the potential of biological terror attacks, but that none of them have actually been able to successfully, cause extinction or to cause, really major damage to society or government because of that. The second piece of evidence is, I think, from the same Bill and Newman article. And this essentially is saying that in addition to the historical example, right, that there's also a lot of technical barriers in the way of terrorist groups, especially terrorist groups without any sort of state backing, to develop biological terror attacks. Essentially, they lack the resources to be able to develop and weaponize any biological agents. They lack the stable environment to grow and experiment on them. And they also lack the patience, because it will take a while to weaponize a biological agent, so that most terrorist groups don't have the set of factors necessary to develop and weaponize viruses, biological agents, what have you, so that there is not actually that big of a risk of a biological terror attack happening. That is the end of the PowerPoint. So if I were to try to summarize this, I would essentially say that the affirmative argument is we need to be better prepared for the next pandemic. The way we do that is we support the United States federal government and NATO's pandemic response programs, funds, et cetera, so that the next time one rolls around, that we are better able to equip it and better able to prevent the sort of unequal harms that has happened as a result of the current COVID pandemic. The set of negative arguments in response to that is essentially to say, firstly, that the plan, or that the status quo, the way things are now, is already moving in the direction of getting more prepared for the next pandemic, is sort of the first major argument. The second major argument is that NATO would not be the best way, or funding NATO would not be the best way to prepare for the next pandemic. And the third argument, which is specifically a response to the biological terrorism advantage, is that actually biological terror attacks are not that scary because they probably wouldn't happen, as proven by both the history of biological terror attacks and the very difficult set of technical abilities and technical resources that you would need in order to weaponize any biological agents. So again, I know that that was a lot of information to throw at people, both in terms of what debate looks like, how it's structured, and the actual content of the arguments. I will open it up to any questions. If anybody has any questions about the set of evidence that I've gone through, or just a general, I'm not sure what you mean by impact, or I'm not sure what you mean by 1EC. So feel free to ask any questions.
We're expecting this little people to be here.
Sorry?
There's only 4 people here. Were you expecting that?
We prepare for any number of people to show up. So whether it's 1 person or 20 people, we have stuff ready. And that's also why we record, because we know not everyone can be here, or, maybe someone hasn't started the program yet.
Well, 2 people are here.
Yes, thank you for joining us. Yeah. And in general, people are also welcome to drop any questions in the chat.
Okay. I know there's the question about sharing, or I'm going to stop sharing my screen if that's okay with everybody.
So we are going to now talk about the deterrence disadvantage, which is available to everyone of every level. So to first break down what a disadvantage is, this is going to be a negative argument that you're going to use pretty much to say, the affirmative comes in and they say, our plan is a good idea because we're going to fix some problem. And the negative is going to come in with a disadvantage and say, no, the plan is a bad idea because it's going to cause some other problem. And essentially the argument is that whatever problem the affirmative causes is worse than whatever they claim they're going to solve. So the way that we kind of present the story of the plan causing some problem due to unintended consequences can be broken down into 4 parts. So the first part is called uniqueness, which has a different meaning in debate than in the regular world, which pretty much says the status quo or the way things are now is okay, but we can't rock the boat any or else we won't be okay. So you'll commonly hear the phrase on the brink, where it's like something is on the brink now. It's kind of like we don't want to push it over the brink or things will be bad. But as long as we don't change anything, we're going to be okay. The second part is the link, which pretty much explains how the plan rocks the boat. So it says, okay, so the uniqueness says everything will be okay if we don't change. And then the link is saying the plan causes some change and that is bad. And the link is what's ultimately going to lead us to the bad thing. So the third part that you'll sometimes see, sometimes you won't, is called the internal link, which is just like the extra steps that get us from whatever change the plan made to the actual bad thing. So if it's like not super self-evident how we get from, A to Z, then steps B through X are the internal link. And then finally, the impact is whatever the bad thing that happens is. This is the thing that you're going to say, no, we can't let this happen. This is way worse than letting whatever the affirmative is trying to stop happen. So impact is just, the bad thing, the negative consequence that is going to happen as a result of the change that the plan caused. So for the deterrence disadvantage, there are a couple of things that are useful to know going in when you're reading through the evidence. So the first one is the concept of deterrence or deterring something or someone. So deterrence refers to pretty much just discouraging someone from doing something. So you'll hear a lot in this that we have to deter Russia, or that, we need to make sure our deterrence is really effective. So that's just saying we need to be able to stop someone from doing something. In this case, it's going to be NATO needs to deter Russia from acting aggressive and escalating war. The second thing is defense spending. This is pretty much just referring to money that we spend on the military. So this can include things like planes, ships, submarines, tanks, other vehicles, missiles, the targeting systems for missiles, the people who build things and other just professionals you have, equipment, training facilities, and then whatever aid we lend to other countries, whether that be money or supplies or what. So pretty much it's important to know that deterrence is discouraging someone from doing something, preventing them from doing it somehow, and then defense spending is just money we spend on military affairs. So let's break down the actual evidence for this disadvantage. The first thing we have is the uniqueness evidence from Lasconjarius in 2022. So the way things are okay now is saying pretty much like, okay, we are just barely right now spending enough on defense and we'll be okay, but we can't cut our military budgets anymore. And we say we specifically mean NATO countries. So NATO countries, the evidence points out, are still spending on defense right now, even though there's economic hardship. So the argument is just that, like, we can't afford any budget cuts, but as long as we don't cut the budgets, we'll be okay. The link from Ceteruli, or the thing that the plan changes, is that it expands NATO's mission to be, instead of just being something that's focused on deterrence, it's now also focused on public health. And this evidence says that NATO can't afford to do everything, so because they have limited resources. So they need to just focus on that one mission of deterrence and not try to get involved in public health. And it also says that if we do focus on public health, then NATO won't be able to do everything, and they won't be able to actually deal with the highest priority threats that are things related to deterrence that we would typically expect them to deal with. The internal link from Coaches and others, that et al. Just means and others, evidence is our internal link. So this is how we get from we're investing in pandemic response, where NATO is investing in pandemic response, to war. So this argument pretty much says that right now Russia is being really aggressive. We can see that through the fact that they've invaded Ukraine, and that's an ongoing war that's happening. And it argues that the only thing that has ever been an effective deterrent against Russia and kept them from escalating things even more is NATO. But NATO specifically, the way NATO is effective is by signaling to Russia. The way they deter Russia is by spending money on their militaries to make Russia think it's a bad idea to attack, because provoking a response from all of the NATO member countries isn't worth it. But if NATO doesn't keep spending, if we don't keep our defense spending up, then Russia won't be as threatened and as scared of the possibility of going to war. So the argument is that we need to keep the defense spending up in order to actually keep deterring Russia. And then the last thing, our impact, is from the Schlosser evidence. And this one says that Putin has done a bunch of things that really indicate that nuclear war is more likely to be triggered by Russia. Some of the things that have been done, some norms that have been broken, is that just the invasion of Ukraine, just starting a war in general, is very aggressive, something that is likely to escalate. They've specifically threatened nuclear attacks against NATO countries. They've said, hey, stop giving Ukraine supplies or we will use nuclear weapons against you. And then they've also bombed some nuclear reactor facilities in Ukraine. So if you go through and read this whole piece of evidence, you'll see it refers to nuclear terrorism. So that's pretty much referring to the bombing of 2 different nuclear facilities in Ukraine. So one of the things that this piece of evidence argues is that the longer the invasion goes on, the more desperate Russia is going to be to end it, to cut off aid to Ukraine. So they're more likely to attack NATO supply lines to keep us from helping Ukraine. And if Russia did end up attacking a NATO country in their efforts to keep us from supplying Ukraine with more supplies, that would lead to World War III. And if we have World War III and we have, over 30 countries involved with nuclear weapons, we're all going to die. So essentially the bad thing that happens is that there's a big war with Russia and a bunch of other countries, including the US, a bunch of whom have nuclear weapons. And it's just like, game over. So the affirmative has a few ways to answer this. So you'll see in the evidence, there's a section called the 2AC block. So a block is just a pre-prepared set of arguments. So for each step, you'll see that there's kind of this space for you to write your own argument. So your own original arguments are typically called analytic arguments in debate. And this first part of the 2AC block focuses on case outweighs. So that pretty much means that whatever the affirmative is talking about and the problems they're solving are more important than whatever the disadvantage is talking about. So whatever analytic you come up with here should focus on why doing the plan to prevent pandemics is more important than spending money to deter war with Russia. And, again, after this little mini lecture, we'll have a brainstorming session. And then the second thing in this block is using a piece of evidence to argue that the case outweighs the disadvantage. So the Lodovico and Sabetti evidence looks at pretty much the impact on human lives and spending that diseases and wars have had, and argues that essentially it's better to spend money on disease prevention than spend oodles of money on disease response. So kind of what Manny was talking about before in the affirmative case of it's better an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's the same idea where it's like, well, if we're worried about money and spending, we should worry more about, preventing the pandemic in the first place, because it's going to be way worse if we actually have to respond to a full-on pandemic instead of just mitigating something that hasn't escalated yet disease-wise. So the costs of disease that the evidence focuses on are specifically related to Ebola, when that outbreak happened in 2014 to 2016, and then COVID-19. So it looks at both how much money we spent responding to them and how many people died. And it's like, we spent, trillions of dollars, we've had millions of people die. So the argument is essentially just, that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, means that it's more important to do the plan than worry about money with the disadvantage. The second part of the block, this one is only for the high school novice part. So if you are a middle school novice, don't worry about this piece. This is not going to be in your packet. If you are a high school novice or middle school JV, then this will be in your packet. So this one is a non-unique argument. So again, it has a space for you to write your own analytic. Here, if it's a non-unique argument, we want to focus on why defense spending / military budgets are not on the brink right now. This could be that there's lots of defense spending right now, or that there are some other economic factors in the plan that are bad for defense spending. And then the second thing we have is the McKenzie evidence, which goes for the kind of that first option, which says, no, we are spending a bunch of money on the military right now. Like ever since Russia invaded Ukraine, NATO has upped its defense spending dramatically, specifically to deter Russia. So we don't need to worry about the plan slashing budgets too much or taking away focus, because they've been really dedicated to increasing their deterrence since the war started. The next part of the block, so this will be the argument 2 out of 3 if you're in the middle school novice packet, 3 out of 4 if you're looking at the high school novice packet, is a no link argument. So this is essentially like, yeah, why does the plan not ruin everything by causing a change to the status quo? So the first part are analytic. It should focus on why doing the plan doesn't stop NATO from deterring Russia. So the piece of evidence we have, the Jovic-Lozic evidence, cites a report directly from NATO that said that their pandemic response program doesn't prevent them from effectively deterring anyone. It talks about how like there's separate missions that NATO carries out. So one is that Article 3 mission to build resilience, and then there's a separate part of NATO with its own missions that focuses on security, and those parts are still fully staffed and still focused on their mission, even with the pandemic response that we've seen from COVID. So it's incorrect of the negative to say that if NATO does anything with pandemics, they won't be able to do anything with deterrence, because NATO has proved through COVID that they are capable of doing both and still being focused on both missions and carrying both out successfully. And then the final thing that we're going to talk about is the 2AC block, the third argument for MS Novice, fourth for HS Novice, which is saying that there is no impact. So finally, we're going to say again that your analytic you're going to have some analytic argument. Here, you can focus on why war with Russia wouldn't actually happen, or it wouldn't be as bad as the negative says, where it's like, okay, even if, something happens, there's not going to be a full-out nuclear war or something like that. And then the evidence we have is the Verschbo and Lodel evidence, which says that, Putin isn't actually likely to risk nuclear escalation. Like whenever he threatens to use nukes, or is like, you know what, I'm willing to respond with nuclear attacks or anything like that, he's just bluffing. Because it wouldn't do anything to actually help Russia's military if they did do that. And that it's too risky to, chance NATO having a full-out response and have over 30 countries all fighting against you as if they have nothing to lose. So this evidence is kind of saying that Putin threatening to use nukes is Russia's way of deterring NATO. So NATO spends a lot on their military capacities to keep Russia from getting too aggressive. The way Russia tries to keep NATO from doing things they don't like is by threatening to use nuclear weapons. So it says Putin doesn't actually want World War III. He just wants NATO to be too scared to help Ukraine more. So when he says, I'm going to nuke you all if you keep supplying Ukraine, it's just a bluff to try to get NATO to not help Ukraine more. So that's it for kind of the deterrence disadvantage. Does anyone have any questions about any of that, about the difference between a disadvantage and an advantage, kind of any of these parts in general, or in the specific context of this evidence? Anything?
Nope.
All right. I'm going to stop sharing. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the public health disadvantage, which is for high school novice, and if you're a middle school JV, you're also going to have access to this. So if you're a middle school novice, don't worry about this disadvantage, but for you high schoolers who are going to use this, let's jump into it. So again, the structure of a disadvantage is typically that we have uniqueness, which establishes that things are okay now, but if we change things, if we rock the boat, they won't be. We've got our link, which says the plan rocked the boat somehow. Our internal link, which explains how whatever change the plan caused is going to actually lead to the ultimate negative consequence. And then whatever that ultimate consequence is, our impact. So for this disadvantage, we're going to see one piece of evidence that has both the uniqueness and link parts instead of having them as two different arguments. And then we're also going to see that there isn't a specific piece of 1NC evidence for the internal link with the public health disad. But if you are explaining how the change the plan makes leads to the impact, if you're talking about kind of those extra steps in between, you are generally talking about the internal link. And finally, the 1NC for this disadvantage has an extra argument that we're about to talk about that doesn't fall into this typical disad structure. And in general, if you're like, well, where was that last part that Elysia talked about. Don't worry, as long as you have these parts, you're good. But for this specific disadvantage, we are going to talk about an extra argument that's in there, which is a case turn. So turns in general are arguments that make the other team's argument a reason to vote for you. So pretty much saying, okay, actually, if you want to deal with what the affirmative is talking about, then you should vote negative. Or if you actually want to help fix the problems that the negative disadvantage is worried about, you should vote affirmative. So just as a reminder, disadvantages are typically based on the consequences of doing the plan. While those consequences are generally unrelated to the 1AC case, a case turn or turns case argument says that those unintended consequences of doing the plan also mean that the 1AC can't solve their case. So a case turn makes it so that you as the negative can say, okay, if you want to solve the affirmative harms, you should actually vote negative instead of doing the plan. There's other kinds of turn arguments, but we're not going to worry about those today. So a couple of key concepts that are useful to think about when you're looking at this disadvantage. The first is militarization or securitization, which is just making a non-military issue a military issue. So anything that is not related to like literal war that we then make an issue that is like, okay, the military should deal with this, that would be something that has become militarized or securitized. And this is often done using language and rhetoric. So if you think, so some militaristic language could be when we talk about, you know, the war on something like the war on drugs, the war on poverty, or we refer to fighting some invisible enemy. So yeah, anytime we are making something a military issue and it's not about real literal war, then that is militarization. The next thing is authoritarianism. So authoritarianism doesn't have like one concrete definition, but it generally refers to systems of government where there's like one central government that has a lot of power. There's not really any limits on things from things that we typically think of like elections or checks and balances. Those aren't there. So these are places that are particularly prone to human rights abuses. So if you think of a dictatorship, dictatorships are authoritarian governments. These are places where the government typically stays in power and tries to keep things the same by suppressing human rights. So if you're a protester or a critic of whoever's in charge, you're likely going to be dealt with violently. The laws are usually really ambiguous, so whoever is in charge can do whatever they want and change the rules if they want to do something like give themselves immunity or remove term limits. So if you think of a government where maybe the president was suddenly like, you know what, there's no more term limit for president, or we're actually canceling the election and I'm just going to keep serving. Those are the kind of things that rulers and authoritarian systems are able to get away with. So authoritarianism, generally, it's a lot easier to get away with human rights abuses. Usually it's easier to get the military involved in things. Like you might impose martial law, which is just saying like the military is in charge of stuff. So imagine if like instead of the post office delivering mail, the military was in charge of mail, or both with martial law and with a state of emergency, which you might see authoritarian governments abuse. There's kind of a suspending of usual human rights and the typical civil laws that we expect. So other than, you know, the right not to be killed, tortured, or enslaved, the government and the military, and potentially the military, can do whatever they deem necessary to deal with things. And then the last thing is zero sum. You'll often hear that something is a zero sum game, and a zero sum situation is one where not everyone can win. So if one side is going to gain something, the other side has to lose something. So it's like there are no win-win situations, only win-lose, if that makes sense. So now that we've talked about those, let's talk about what the actual evidence says and break it down. So the first thing we have is the unique link, which is from the Gibson Fall evidence. And you all will actually see the entire 1NC for this is all from the Gibson Fall article. So this is the one piece of evidence that has both the uniqueness and link, like I talked about earlier. So the uniqueness argument part of it says that essentially COVID-19 has put the world in a position to decide what the role of militaries in public health should be. And the link argument says that that decision about what that role should be, the plan makes that decision and says, yes, militaries should be public health responders, which theoretically would help with crisis response because the military is able to do some things effectively, but it would be worse for citizens' rights and community trust because of some of the reasons I talked about before with authoritarianism and human rights abuses. So if you're wondering, well, like, what does military involvement in public health look like, other than, the things that the 1AC talks about that are all really nice and cheerful, like, oh, they'll help distribute vaccines and do logistics and prevent outbreaks in the first place. The other things that the military specifically does could be examples of things are enforcing a lot of things, like enforcing lockdowns, disease surveillance, border closures, contact tracing. So if you think about how when we had a lockdown because of COVID in the US, it was generally people were asked to stay home, and there might have been curfews in some places, but it's not like the military was on the street outside to make sure people stayed in their home. So that would be one example of the military being involved. It would also be things like maybe, when the borders close, generally we just like announce it, and, we don't schedule flights from the various airlines into and out of the country, but we don't like get the military involved in being like, oh, we'll make sure that nobody comes into the country. And similar things like that. So pretty much having the military make sure that everything the government wants to do is enforced, with violence if necessary, is kind of what that looks like, or what that could look like. So the next piece of evidence, we go straight from unique link to impact. Again, we don't have a specific piece of internal link evidence here. So this piece of evidence argues that if we get NATO involved in pandemic response, public health will become militarized. So we will come to view fighting disease like fighting a war. And generally, whenever the military has to deal with some sort of war, whether it's a literal one or a metaphorical one, then they'll justify doing whatever it takes to win the war. So we can end up in an authoritarian situation where perhaps we're in a state of emergency or we're under martial law. And so people's human rights are suspended, where it's like, listen, we'll do whatever we have to do, even if it's something that typically we wouldn't be allowed to, because we have to win this war on disease. And then the other thing is that part of using the military as a global health actor means that even if the military is just doing things like distributing vaccines, we would have to deploy them across the globe. So if NATO ups its pandemic response, that will necessarily involve sending a bunch of different militaries from the NATO member countries to various places around the globe. And that would increase tensions with other countries, which could potentially lead to war. If you're a country that does not like NATO, or you don't like a specific member country, suddenly having their military nearby trying to run things might not sit well with you. Or maybe if you wanted some non-military aid, but they're like, no, we're sending the military, that's how you get the vaccines, then those are some things that could increase tensions and make war more likely. So the impacts here are both authoritarianism and war. Finally, we have our turns case argument. So again, this is arguing that the impact of the disadvantage actually makes it so that the affirmative cannot solve their whole pandemic AF. So we're going to see that term zero sum again, where we say public health funding is zero sum. So for the military to get resources for public health, civilian organizations have to lose them. So the more resources aren't just a thing where it's like, okay, we will give every organization X amount of dollars no matter what. It's more like, okay, we have this much money. It has to be shared among all of you. So if NATO comes in and suddenly they need money, then that means that it's not going to go to organizations like the CDC or the WHO. And also, the more the military is relied on for public health, the more, likely it makes those impacts we talked about, where it's like, the more it's justified to use authoritarian measures to violate people's human rights in the name of like, well, we have to have a lockdown. We have to make sure that people, get access to vaccines. Like pretty much like, we have to make sure that we like deal with this pandemic correctly, even if that means, violating some human rights. So this is saying that, not only will it risk authoritarianism, but like public health agencies are going to be in a worse position if we let NATO kind of join the public health mission. And that's going to prevent the affirmative from actually achieving the pandemic prevention that they want when they talk about solving the harms of their 1AC. So the 2AC has some options to respond to this. In our 2AC block, again, we're going to see that there's spaces for you to make your own analytic arguments against these. in addition to the basic arguments that we provide with evidence. So first, we have a non-unique argument. So for your analytic, you should focus here on refuting the claim that what we do now will definitely determine the level of military involvement in public health that the world accepts. So if you think like, no, doing this plan will not lock in this militarized healthcare mindset, this is where you would explain that. And then we have the Kalkman evidence also making a non-unique argument, which says that militaries responding to pandemics is like not new. It happened before COVID-19. So the affirmative or the negative saying that, oh, we're in a unique moment because of COVID is not true. So the evidence specifically cites countries such as Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Brazil using their militaries for pandemic response in the past, and says Western militaries were deployed around the world to help fight disease. And some of the diseases that have triggered a military response in the past have been Ebola, Zika, certain strains of the flu, and HIV/AIDS. So this card is pretty much just saying, no, military response to pandemics is like not something that only happens because of the plan. Next, we have the second part of the 2AC block, which actually consists of 4 arguments, including your analytic, that will come together to argue that both that military involvement in public health is not bad and to turn the disad. So just like the 1NC tried to turn the case, you're going to turn the disad by arguing that solidifying military involvement in pandemic response is actually a good thing. So first off, we need an analytic. So your analytic could focus on why the military being involved in public health doesn't automatically cause authoritarianism or human rights abuses or cause us to go to war with some other country, even if there's tensions. And if you can think of reasons why it's good for the military to be involved in pandemic response, those would also make great analytics. Again, we've got some evidence to help us. So the Kalkman 2020 evidence specifically says that military pandemic response doesn't actually hurt civilian public health organizations, so it doesn't have that trade-off that the negative talks about with their zero-sum game. And they talk about how the military is better prepared to do some things that civilian hospitals and organizations might have difficulty with, and that on their own, civilian hospitals get overwhelmed. So if we think about how, you might have heard in the news a lot during this pandemic about how hospitals were overrun. It was like they were just out of beds. They were totally just at full capacity all the time. That's the kind of thing where the military is better prepared to like not get overwhelmed with capacity, not run out of supplies, and generally just act in an emergency. The second piece of evidence, the first Watterson and Comrade card, has a similar take where it talks about how militaries are the best option for emergency response because civilian facilities typically struggle with certain things during a pandemic. So things like on top of like, just being like, oh my gosh, they're at full capacity. It's just like their resources are generally stretched thin. Supply chains are disrupted. So you've probably seen just like everywhere, whether it's like at a restaurant or in a store or whatever, that supply chains have been disrupted, which means it's harder just to get the materials you need to effectively like run a hospital or anything like that. And things are just generally really chaotic. Whereas the military is very independent. So they have their own facilities, their own supplies, and the nature of military training also means that they're much more prepared to act in these chaotic, high-stress situations that would be much more difficult for just some random civilians to deal with. So given all that, we should want the military to work together with civilian infrastructure to fight pandemics. And this last piece of evidence, the second Watterson and Comrade card, specifically highlights that when we try to track numbers related to disease, it talks about disease surveillance. So that just means like tracking the numbers with disease, like how many cases are there, how many hospitalizations are there, how many deaths are there, things like that. How many vaccines did we get out? Having the military help is crucial to know what's going on in some places. So there are some places that are just like really remote and hard to reach. And just because there are people who are really qualified and know a lot about disease doesn't mean that they are equipped to be able to get to everyone and know what's going on everywhere. So having the military be able to go in and help with the disease surveillance, the disease monitoring in those places that are hard to get to, either just because of physical location or because maybe they're in just a, place that is physically dangerous, it's hard to reach, there's violence in the area, something like that. It's really useful to have the military be able to go in there because the alternative might be that we just don't have that data at all. So overall, this block just, says the military is actually really useful for pandemics and is a big help for all of the civilian public health organizations. So this is going to be your route to arguing against the public health dissad. So, and this is why it is a turn, because you're like, actually, we are the key. We are good. Like getting involved, locking in this whole pandemic, this whole military is key to responding to pandemics is a good thing because of all these reasons that the military is good. So thanks for joining us today, and have a good evening.